Hello and welcome to this context revision video for the poem Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland. First point to note is that this poem is not autobiographical. Beatrice Garland is not Japanese, does not have Japanese heritage, and her father was not a kamikaze pilot. However, she carried out meticulous research and was particularly inspired to write this poem after the 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers in New York. She was also inspired by her time working in the NHS with patients who had faced death or who had undergone trauma, and the long-lasting mental health aspects this can have and the impact on your own family as well. The poem also tackles the issue of indoctrination, better known as brainwashing, which is when someone is manipulated to believe that they are absolutely doing the right thing. However, there were several kamikaze pilots who chose to abandon their mission in real life, just like in the poem. So this poem is based on some real-life case studies and anecdotes. Over to Mr. Thompson now for more historical context about the kamikaze pilot scheme.
Hello, I've been asked to record this by your English teachers to give you a little bit of background about the history of some of the poems that you are studying. Today we're going to be looking at the kamikaze pilots to give you a bit of background about what kind of mentality they had and where the concept comes from. So to begin with, we need to look at the actual historical background of kamikaze to understand why that happened in World War II. Now, it translates roughly to divine wind, and we first see it used as a reference to a typhoon which sweeps away a Mongol invasion fleet in 1281. Now, by 1281, the Mongolians had already conquered China and large parts of Russia and Central Asia. They are one of the largest empires ever to have existed in history. So if they had landed their invasion fleet on Japan, it's highly likely they would have conquered the entire island. So the typhoon is seen as like divine intervention from the gods and saving Japan from the Mongolians because they never try and invade the island again. We then fast forwards a few hundred years and Japan is ruled by a warrior caste called the samurai. They have far more privileges than everyday people and they functionally govern the country underneath either the shogun or the emperor. And the samurai have a code called Bushido. This code emphasizes honor and courage in battle, so things like defeat and surrender are seen as incredibly shameful and something to be avoided at all costs. Or, if you are faced with defeat, then you take the honorable way out, which is often a form of ritualized suicide called harikari. So, by World War II, the samurai caste does not exist anymore. The samurai are abolished at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, but the code of Bushido continues in its armed forces, this idea of death before dishonor, which brings us to our kamikaze pilots in World War II. So by 1944, Japan is most definitely losing World War II. Both its army and navy are being pushed back towards mainland Japan. Japan has an issue in that it can't train skilled pilots quickly enough to replace the pilots that are being killed in combat. So what they decide to do is they have these specially chosen units that are formed with the express intent of launching suicide attacks on enemy naval forces, mostly on the Americans, but also American allies like the British operating in the Pacific Ocean. They'd pack the planes absolutely full of explosives, extra fuel, extra bombs, so that when the planes impacted with the ships, they would cause maximum damage, and the pilots would then deliberately target ships which would have the biggest impact if they were able to destroy them. So, I mean, the image that's just popped up on the screen now, that shows like that explosion is a kamikaze pilot being shot down in mid-air. Obviously, most planes do not explode like that, which shows just how heavily laden they were with fuel and explosives. One of the more famous photos of World War II from kamikaze pilots is the second image that's just appeared. If you look to the left-hand side of that photo, you can see a kamikaze pilot piloting a Zero fighter that is just about to crash into the side decking of a US battleship. So this is literally seconds before impact. This is how close they would get. And they could cause a tremendous amount of destruction. Now, they did sink over 30 smaller ships, but they'd never actually halted Allied advances in the Pacific. And as an example of the kind of destruction they could do, if we take a look at that third picture, that is the deck of an aircraft carrier there, where a kamikaze pilot landed on one end of it. And as you can see, it's blown a hole clean through the deck of the carrier. You can see the sea underneath. So the planes did do a tremendous amount of damage when they hit, but it was never enough to actually stop or set back the Allied forces. The other thing we need to think about, though, is not just what the kamikaze pilots did, but also the pilots themselves. So most of the pilots are fairly young men. Now, within Japanese society, they're hailed as heroes who are willing to sacrifice their lives for emperor and for Japan. It is seen as a courageous thing they're doing. But as with most things, the reality is a little bit different. They are celebrated, they are waved off by people. So you get this impression of a society that is dedicated to victory and will kill themselves in order to bring that about. It fits in with the idea of Bushido, so it very much ties in with the Japanese mentality, and it is seen, keyword there being seen, as the right thing to do. And they organize themselves into squadrons, they'll be given special treatment. A lot of them would have their photos taken before going off on a mission. The second photo is a kamikaze pilot squadron, kind of pre-mission. But not all the pilots are willing volunteers. When they volunteer, they're given a slip of paper which is, I volunteer willingly, I volunteer, and no. And in a lot of cases, they were simply asked until they said yes. So even though the idea of a choice is there, many of them are simply pressured into doing it against their own personal opinion. Now, not all missions are successful. A lot of the planes have mechanical problems, aren't able to take off or make it to their targets, and sometimes the pilots simply cannot find a suitable target to ram their planes into, so they return to base. Now, this is understandable, and they do accept that sometimes problems do occur. However, refusing to carry out a mission, refusing to take off, or repeatedly failing a mission due to lack of targets or mechanical failure is seen as an act of cowardice. Now, in the most extreme cases, those pilots would be executed for cowardice. If they weren't executed, they would almost certainly be shunned because they were seen as failing their duty. Which brings us to the poem that you're reading, looking at the kind of experiences of a kamikaze pilot. Anyway, I hope that helps you understand a little bit more about what kamikaze pilots are and the mindset of the Japanese, and that helps you understand the poem a little bit better than it did before. Take care.
So let's try to link this contextual information to some of the key quotations in the poem. Firstly, the first line of the poem, her father embarked at sunrise. Sunrise and the sun is a classic symbol of the country of Japan featuring on their flag. The next quote is head full of powerful incantations. Incantations means a spell or a curse, and the fact that the writer of this poem is suggesting that the kamikaze had been put under some kind of spell does lead us to believe that he is under the powers of indoctrination or brainwashing. The next quote is a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head. This is part of the sacrificial ritual kamikazes would go through. They would have the sword in the plane with them, ready to kill themselves in that way as well, and they would have to have a shaven head. Next, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes. This shows the levels of alienation that he went through, even from his own wife and family, and it indicates that there was a level of shame that was part of him coming back to the village, not having completed his mission. Lastly, and the neighbours too, they treated him as though he no longer existed. So this further shows the fact that he was shunned and marginalised by society upon his arrival back in the village. If you'd like to do some further reading into this topic of kamikaze pilots, I have provided 2 links for you to Guardian articles about some real-life case studies of pilots that decided not to follow through with their mission. I hope you found this video useful, and please hit me up in the comments if you have any further questions.